Posted by John David Anderson. Chapter 15, The Bet. The swollen purple pimple of school's ongoing war of words came to a pus-filled and potentially explosive head the day Dee almost got dunked. Before that, it had stayed mostly on the page, or in our case, on the yellow square. But there was always the possibility that words wouldn't be enough, that somebody would push it one step further. Dee Day. Which really isn't funny, I know, but looking back, all of it, Rose, the catch, the game, the notes, they all seem to be building to that moment in the boys' restroom and the downhill slide that followed. There was no way of knowing it at the time, no portents of doom, no crows circling overhead. It wasn't raining frogs, it wasn't raining at all that Wednesday, just overcast and cold like it had been all week. Everyone coming to school with pink ears because they're too cool to wear hats. The only thing strange that day was that Wolf didn't show up. He wasn't feeling well and convinced his mom to let him stay home. At least that's what Rose said when she met me by the noteless locker that morning. He texted me this morning to let me know. He didn't let me know, I said. I'm letting you know, she said. I shut my locker. They were almost all noteless now, thanks to Principal Whittingham's proclamation and the darting eyes of the sweater-clad authorities prowling the halls. The open field warfare had vanished. The number of notes decorating the halls dwindled from hundreds to dozens. Like the cell phones packed away in clear plastic tubs in the front office, the stacks of notes were tucked in the bottoms of our backpacks. But the war was far from over. The sticky notes were still a perfect weapon, secret and succinct. But you could tell the rules were changing. The volleys and retorts, once restricted to 3 square inches, spilled back over into conversations. Shouting matches could be heard down the hall. You'd go to watch and see 2 kids yelling at each other about who said or didn't say what until a teacher's voice hollered at them to get to class. The notes had brought out the worst in us, and some of us weren't all that great to begin with. I do wonder if it would have gone differently if Wolf had been with us that day. I know it would have gone different if Bench had been, but I'd barely even seen him since the catch. He'd stopped taking the bus in the mornings, and I'd heard he was hitching a ride with David Sandlin, the team's tight end, whose father dropped them off on the way to work. It made sense. They lived only 2 blocks apart. But he only lived a few blocks from me, too. When I did see Bench, in class or in the halls, his reaction depended on who he was with. If he was by himself, he'd stop and we'd talk for 2 minutes about nothing in particular, which is to say not Wolf or Rose, or whether she sat with us at lunch nowadays, or why he lied about going to dinner with his family, because those weren't 2-minute conversations. If he was talking with someone else, though, he would just nod, which was my cue to just nod back. We were still friends, the nod said, but things were different now, which is a shame, because had Bench been with us, I'm pretty sure Cameron Cole and his buddies wouldn't have done what they did. At least I hope not. With Wolf out for the day, the seat between Dee and me sat empty in English, and for a moment I expected Rose to come fill it in. But she stayed in her usual spot by the door, as if she was worried about taking Wolf's place. I passed Dee a note while Mr. Sword was scrawling a timeline of ancient Rome on the board. "Did Rose come to visit you yesterday?" He mouthed the word, "Huh?" The perplexed look on his face elaborated. "Why would you even ask me that?" I shrugged, just curious. Dee flipped the note over and started to scrawl something on the back, but Mr. Sword turned around and Dee was forced to tuck it into his lap. The big ham had already suspended 4 kids for using sticky notes, but some of the teachers were slower to enforce the rule than others. The reason Wolf wasn't suspended for his dig at Jason was because Mr. Sword crumpled the evidence and threw it away. Mr. Sword, who just last week had encouraged us to share our most profound thoughts with each other on these same yellow squares. When he got hold of a note now, he didn't even bother to read it. He just balled it up and tossed it in the trash. It was his way of protecting us from a trip to the office, he said, though I suspect he was trying to protect us from more than that. Mr. Sword finished his timeline of the events in Caesar's life and turned to the class. "Why do you think Brutus kills himself at the end of the play?" he asked. Spoiler alert," Samantha said. "It would be, Miss Bowles, if I hadn't asked you to finish it last night." I flipped through the pages like everyone else, hoping, by looking busy, that I wouldn't get called on. "Well, let's start here. Why do you think Antony calls Brutus the noblest Roman of them all at the end?" Maybe they were into each other. It was Noah Kyle this time, though I could hear a chorus of snickering from behind. "What was that, Mr. Kyle?" "Nothing. I just said maybe they were besties or something." Mr. Sword looked irritated, eyes narrowing, honing in. "Have you even bothered to read the play, Noah? Or any book this year, for that matter?" Noah coughed and shrank down in his seat, but I could see the corners of his smug little mouth twitch. Mr. Sword shook his head. He called on Amanda, who'd managed to finish the play while re-dyeing her hair, apparently. It was green today. "The other conspirators did what they did because they were jealous of Caesar's power," she said. "But Brutus thought he was really doing what was best for Rome." "Excellent. But does that make it right?" Again, nobody raised their hands. "Seriously, people, is it all right to murder one person in cold blood if it will improve the lives of thousands of others? Is that justifiable? Yes, Simone?" "Who cares? I mean, it's not like any of us is going to go out and kill someone." For some reason, half the class found this amusing. Mr. Sword did not. "We are speaking hypothetically, Simone," he said, weaving between our desks. "And it doesn't have to be murder. I'm sure there's been some time in your life when you've used that same logic, some point where you decided the reward was worth doing something that you knew was wrong. Maybe you stole something, or maybe you cheated on a test, or maybe you teased somebody, knowing it would help you to fit in better with your friends." He stopped between Jason and Noah. "Would you pick on one kid if it meant that a dozen more would like you?" "Everybody already likes me," Jason said. From across the room, Rose groaned, and Jason shot her a dirty look. Mr. Sword bent down and spoke softly in Jason's ear, but it was loud enough that I could hear. "That's probably what Caesar thought, too." At least that shut them all up for the rest of the class, though once I looked back to find them passing a sticky note between them, Noah to Cameron, and I didn't like the look on either of their faces. Dee Dee, Rose, and I walked to lunch together, stopping by Dee Dee's locker so he could grab his lunchbox and check for notes. More people had taken to folding the Post-its in half and stuffing them into the slatted vents at the top of the locker. That way teachers couldn't come by and peel them off. Nobody had left Dee Dee any messages, not today at least. We walked toward the cafeteria, and Dee Dee and I stopped by the restroom, Rose joking that we were a couple of girls and saying she'd wait for us in the hall. Dee Dee took a stall. He always did his business behind closed doors, regardless of the number. I stood and waited for him by the sink and read 2 notes that were stuck to the side of the trash cans. One showed a crude drawing of Principal Whittingham. You could tell by the glasses and the tie, except he was sporting a snout that took up half his face, and the words "Pig on Patrol" were written underneath. The other note informed anyone who cared that Tracy F. was a word I'd rather not repeat. I didn't know who Tracy F. was, But I took the note down regardless and threw it in the trash. I left the one about winning him up, though. It made me smile. Dee emerged and took the sink next to me. He looked at the principal's piggish face and frowned. "Kinda rude," he said. "Kinda funny," I countered. "I guess," Dee said in that way that lets you know he doesn't agree in the slightest. I almost regret starting it now, that whole note thing. He spoke with a resigned sigh of a superhero lamenting the fact that he has to go save the world yet again. "I think you're giving yourself too much credit," I said. "Besides, if it wasn't this, it would just be something else." I looked at the old markings on the stall doors. Typical middle school graffiti, curse words and crude drawings done in Sharpie and thick pencil scratches. At least the sticky notes were easier to clean up. As if reading my mind, Dee reached across me and crumpled up the note about Principal Whittingham. He tossed it toward the can, but it bounced off the rim and onto the floor. He was bending down to pick it up as the bathroom door opened and Cameron walked in, followed by Noah and some kid a year younger than us that everyone just called T. I didn't know what the T stood for. I didn't know much about the kid at all, except that he was taller than me and hung out with Jason and Cameron and them. He probably attended the same summer camp for how to most effectively be a jerk. Cameron's eyes fell on Dee standing by the sink. Noah and T stood by the door. They made no move toward the bank of urinals or the stalls, and I could feel that spreading, hair-tickling tingle that's your body's way of telling you to pack up and go. I looked at Dee, a warning shot to suggest he had to hurry up and finish drying his hands. Then I walked past Cameron, squeezing between him and the wall. Just make it to the door. That was the key. Just make it to the door in the hallway, and the rush of the other kids headed to lunch, and the occasional wandering glance of a teacher, and the chance to blend into the crowd. But as soon as I took another step, Noah Kyle stepped in front of me, blocking my way. He actually crossed his arms, pulling a page right out of the Hollywood Thug Handbook. "Excuse me," I said, hoping to strike a tone that was polite but also a little threatening. But Noah acted like he couldn't even hear me. I tried to sidestep him, but he matched my movement, continuing to block the door. I looked back over my shoulder, and behind me Dee stood his ground, the used paper towel bunched in his hands, his Lord of the Rings lunchbox still sitting on the edge of the sink. Cameron stood in front of him, between us, blocking Dee's way. He held out his hand. "All right, Aardvark, let's have it." It was a name they'd used before, close enough to Advik to supposedly be funny, though I never heard anyone but them laugh at it ever. They used to call him a poo sometimes, because it was the only other Indian person that they knew. Sometimes that would get a giggle from others. There'd already been one sticky note telling Dee to get back to the Quickie Mart this week, probably left by one of these guys. Cameron snapped his fingers, then opened his hand again right in front of Dee's face. Dee handed over the used paper towel. Cameron swatted it to the floor. "Not that, stupid. Your good luck charm, your little geek cube. Hand it over. I want to see it." He meant the die. Dee's special die. Dee flashed me a look. The meaning was obvious. Oh, crap. That was a given, but also, how does he know? Everyone knew that Wolf was a piano prodigy and that I wrote that one poem that one time, but we'd always kept the die to ourselves. Dee's lips moved, his mouth working, but no sound came out. "Just back off, Cameron, all right?" I took a step toward him, but as soon as I did, the kid named T came up behind me and put a hand on my shoulder. I shrugged it off, but it popped right back, squeezing this time. Everything seemed to be escalating much too quickly, veering out of control, at least out of our control. "I just want to see it," Cameron said again. "You keep it in your pocket, don't you?" "I'm sure not going in after it." The boy behind me laughed. He'd probably like that, Noah said. Probably, Cameron said, keeping his eyes on Didi. Just like his friend, A2 Patel? T still had his claws dug into my arm. I could get free if I wrenched hard enough, but I hadn't figured out what step came after that. If Wolf were here, it might be different. We'd at least be even, but as it stood, there were 3 against 2, if Didi and I even counted as 2. Come on, I just want to see it if it's true. Then I'll let you go. Didi looked at me and I nodded. Sometimes it was just easier to give them what they wanted. Usually it was just a laugh at your expense. That's probably all this was, too. Didi dipped 2 trembling fingers into his front pocket and fished out his ebony die with the gold emblazoned dragon on it. He held it up. There, he murmured. Happy? He went to stuff it back in, but Cameron snatched it from Didi's hands and took it between his thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the dull halogen lights. Catching its reflection in the dingy mirror, he shook his head. Can you believe this? He turned and showed the die to his friends, the ones I could hear breathing behind me. Didi made a move to snatch it back, quicker than I would have thought him capable of. But Cameron cupped it in his fist and pulled it away. You've seen it all, right? Now give it back. Didi's face burned. I looked at the reflection of the door in the mirror, thinking somebody was bound to come in and break this up any second now. More likely they would see what's happening and then turn the other way. But even that might be enough. Times like this, a kind of spell seems to take hold, and you feel like time has stopped for everyone but you. Unfortunately, the door stayed closed. Seriously, Cameron, just give the dice back, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Cameron exchanged looks with his 2 buddies, some predetermined signal. He took a step toward one of the closed stalls. Is it true that you actually roll this thing to make decisions? He asked. Who told you that? Didi said through a shuddering breath. I could tell he was doing his best to hold it together. Begging or crying would just encourage them. He could run. That was an option. T wasn't holding on to his shoulder. Didi could bolt for the door and maybe slip past Noah Kyle, go find a teacher or something. But he just stood there, watching Cameron's hand. Cameron ignored Didi's question. So what? He said. I pick a number, and if it comes up, then that's what I do. He kicked the stall doors open. All right, let's try it. I'll roll. If it comes up evens, I'll flush this thing down the toilet, doing you a favor, giving you the freedom to grow up and start making your own decisions for a change. If it's odds, he turned and grinned at his friends. If it's odds, we'll have to flush something else. The boy behind me laughed again. Noah said, He's probably small enough to fit. Didi held his stomach with both hands and bit hard into his upper lip. He looked at me, desperate. I'd had enough. I wrenched my arm free with a painful jerk and took a step toward the stall where Cameron was standing. All right, freaking hilarious, like everything, like always. Now just give the stupid dice back. I didn't get more than 2 steps before Noah and the boy named T teamed up, each of them taking an arm now, trapping me between them. Didi still stood by the sink, paralyzed. Please don't, he croaked. But Cameron ignored him. So how about it, evens or odds? And without waiting for Didi to answer, Cameron tossed the 10-sided die against the wall. Didi suddenly came back to life, collapsing to all fours and scrabbling against the filthy bathroom tiles. But Cameron crouched down and grabbed his shirt, pulling him backward. The die rebounded and spun for a moment before settling down, dragon side up. That's a 1, isn't it? Didi didn't say anything, just stayed there on his hands and knees. Not your lucky day, I guess. Cameron lifted Didi up by the armpits, locking his arms and dragging him toward the bathroom stall. I couldn't see Didi's face, but I could hear him pleading, breathless, "Please don't, Cameron, please don't, please, please, please." "Not my call," Cameron laughed. "The die has spoken." I couldn't help but think of how many times one of us had used that exact phrase. There was the sound of scuffling feet, of Dee Dee kicking the walls of the bathroom stall. I tried to wrench my arms free, grunting with the effort, but the other two held tight. Dee Dee screamed just as the bathroom door swung open, then squeaked closed. The grips on my arms slackened as the two kids holding me twisted around, twisting me with them. Rose stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, periwinkle eyes taking everything in. She let out a low whistle. The other two boys let go of me, and I took a cautious step toward her. Cameron stood halfway in the stall, arms still wrapped around Dee Dee. "This is the men's room. You're not supposed to be in here," she said. "If it's really a men's room, then neither are you," Rose smiled, almost daring him to laugh. Or maybe daring him not to. I'd seen that look before. "Let go of him," she demanded. I had said the same thing less than a minute before, of course, but I wasn't Rose Holland. She was taller than all of them, her face taut, lip tucked under her top teeth, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever seen her truly angry. Cameron unwound his arms and pushed Dee Dee away, nearly running him into the bay of sinks on the other side of the room. "We were just playing a game," he said. "We made a little bet. He owes me." Rose glanced at me. I shook my head. "He was about to dunk him," I said. "He stole Dee Dee's die." She turned back to Cameron, glaring. Cameron shrugged and gave Dee Dee's 10-sided die a kick, causing it to skitter into a corner. "Whatever, the dweeb can keep it. We're leaving anyway." He took a step toward the door. Rose didn't budge. "Not yet, you're not." Cameron froze, only a few feet away from her. Obviously, he hadn't factored Rose Holland into the equation when he followed Dee Dee and me into the bathroom, but he wasn't going to back down either. "You're going to stop us from walking out that door? You're a girl, loosely speaking," he added. Noah snickered. "A girl who's strong enough to knock your teeth out, loosely speaking." Noah stopped laughing. Cameron thought about it for a second, swallowed hard and thick, it seemed, then blew her off with a wave of his arm. "I'm not going to fight you, if that's what you're thinking. I wouldn't hit a girl, even one like you." Rose shrugged. "Fine. And since you're in the mood to make bets, how about you and I make one? If you win, I'll let you dunk all three of us. But if I win, you have to walk around school with a note stuck to your shirt the whole day that says whatever I want it to." Dee Dee looked at me and sniffed. Cameron and his friends exchanged glances. I tried to catch Rose's eye and ask her, "What the heck do you think you're doing?" with a carefully constructed facial expression, but she wouldn't take her eyes off Cameron. He shook his head. "You're kidding, right? That's the stupidest thing I ever heard." Rose's voice was like steel. "Take the bet or take a swing. I'm good either way." Dee Dee and I stood next to each other, looking from Rose to Cameron and back again. Possible she was bluffing, but I didn't think so. "She's nuts, man. Let's just go," T said. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Rose was blocking the door. There was absolutely no chance of squeezing by, not without her permission. "I'm serious. You want to walk out of here? You take the bet. Otherwise, we end it right now." She looked down at her black boots, the toes scuffed gray. I wondered if she'd ever kicked anyone with those boots before. Cameron clearly didn't think she was bluffing either. "All right, fine, whatever," he said, mustering the necessary bravado to save face with his friends. "You want to roll the geek stupid dice again?" Rose shook her head. "No dice. This is Bratton," she said smugly. "There's only one way to settle a bet around here, right?" "The gauntlet? Are you crazy?" The three of us were sitting on a bench outside the cafeteria. Dee Dee was still shaking, the snot crusting over on his shirt sleeve. After Cameron and his friends left, only after Rose stepped aside and agreed to let them go, Dee Dee collapsed to the bathroom floor by the trash can and started sobbing. Rose knelt down and wrapped an arm around him, whispering, "It's all right," over and over. I picked up his die and we put it in his hand, but he just grunted and threw it across the room, where it ricocheted off of one of the urinals. It took a few minutes for him to calm down enough to stand up and leave the restroom. Enough time for two other boys to come in, one of them at least having the kindness to ask if we wanted him to get help. Rose thanked him and told him everything was fine. She had it under control. Then she got a wet paper towel and helped Dee Dee wipe his face. We found the bench in the hall and put Dee Dee between us, propping him up on both sides. We were already 10 minutes late to lunch, but it didn't matter. Wolf wasn't here and Bench was sitting somewhere else. There was nobody else who cared if we showed up or not. "We should just go tell Whittingham," I said. "Forget this stupid bet thing. I mean, have you ever seen the gauntlet? There's no way. It's nuts. Totally nuts. This is insane." I was walking quickly, I realized. I wasn't as shaken up as Dee Dee, but then I wasn't the one who'd been dragged into the stall either. Rose, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. "It can't be any worse than having your head stuck in a toilet." "But if you lose, then we're all going to have our heads stuck in the toilet," I said. "I'm not going to lose." "You don't know that," I said. "Neither do you," she countered. "Besides, telling the principal won't work. Trust me. This kind of thing happened at my old school all the time. You report it, and it becomes your word against theirs. Maybe they get suspended, but probably not. Maybe you get blamed too. Doesn't matter. Either way, it'll probably end up the same as before or worse. It's not like that here," I insisted. "It's like that everywhere," Rose said. "This isn't my first rodeo." I shut up, remembering what she'd said before about what it had been like for her in Chicago. Dozer. The bull was implied. I wondered how many times she'd been where Dee Dee was now, sitting on a bench, blurry-eyed, trembling. Wondered if she had ever had people on either side of her, holding her up, or if she had always just sat there by herself. "What if he doesn't even show?" I asked. Half of me suspected that Cameron only agreed to the bet to get out of the restroom before things got messy, before he found himself on his knees looking for a missing tooth beneath the sink. "Then he loses. But don't worry, he'll show," Rose insisted. "Word will get around. He knows what people will say if he doesn't. You said yourself the gauntlet is the place where scores are settled." "It's the place where bones are broken," I amended. "And there's no way you're going to make it all the way down. It's impossible." "I don't have to make it all the way down," Rose said. "I just have to make it farther than he does." Sitting between us, Dee Dee sucked up a noseful of snot. He looked hopefully up at Rose. "If you do win, what are you going to write on the note?" "First things first, I have to win," she said, "which means there's one thing we've got to take care of." My stomach lurched. "Oh, God, please tell me you know how to ride a bike." "Of course I know how to ride a bike," Rose scoffed. "I just don't happen to own one." End of chapter 15.